Midwest Futures by Phil Christman. This is a book that, by all ethical standards of book reviewing, I should not be reviewing because the author is a friend of mine, and when you review something that a friend of yours wrote, I'm sure that violates any number of book reviewing ethics. Although I'm probably making too big of a deal about it because the reach of this channel is minimal. And if this video does at all like my typical videos do, it will probably get only about 20 views. Probably half of those are going to be bots. So maybe I'm allowed a little bit of flexibility here. But I do want to be clear about the conflict of interest there. This is the first time I've reviewed a book by somebody I actually know in real life. I have, I believe, a couple times previously reviewed books by people I knew online, people who I had friendly correspondence with. And in both of those cases, I announced the conflict of interest right at the start of the video. But this is the first time it was actually, somebody I actually hung out with in the flesh. I knew Phil back in college. We went to Kelvin College together. The last 2 years of when I was in college, we were in the same friend group. So I saw him at a lot of parties, shared a lot of conversations with him. And then after I went abroad to Japan, I would be back. At first I was back every year. And I would make a point to try and look him up when he was still in the town or still visiting the town. But I actually have not seen him in person since, I believe, 2006. So I mentioned that all just to give the history. But I have been keeping track of his writing throughout all the years. So initially, some of you might be too young to remember this, but before Facebook and before YouTube and before TikTok and Instagram and all the rest of it, there was an explosion around the year 2003, 2004, where everybody had a blog. I'm one of the outliers in that I've actually kept using that blog all these years. Most of my other friends have did it for about a year and a half or something and then stopped doing it. Phil has had any number of blogs over those years. He's transferred platforms a number of times, but I've followed him each jump he makes. Initially, I was reading him just because, he was an old college friend and I was reading everybody's blogs during those days. But very soon I got sucked into his writing style. And I used to, because of the time difference, I was living in Japan. So people would post during the day and it would show up in my feed the next morning. So I'd be waking up in the morning, I'd be having a cup of coffee, and I'd be checking to see what people had written on their blogs while I'd been sleeping. And Phil's was always one of my favorites to check out. It was always something well written and always something thought-provoking. And it was just the perfect way to start my morning while I was having my cup of coffee. And he went through periods where he was blogging prolifically, and then I just got used to waking up every morning reading his blog with my coffee. And then he went through periods where the blogs were in various states of neglect. But at any rate, I've been reading the stuff he's been writing for years, even though I haven't seen him in person for years. And in fact, at this point, here we are in 2025, I feel like I know him much better as a writer and blogger than somebody I knew in real life. So he published this book in 2020. And actually, since he published this book, he's had 2 other books published. How to Be Normal, and a book that's just out now called Why Christians Should Be Leftists. I haven't read either of those two books yet. And I had mixed feelings about reading this one, precisely because of the awkwardness of reviewing it. And I've had a project ever since 2006 where I have to review everything I read. Initially it was on my blog. It's now mostly migrated over to this YouTube channel. And once I have a project, I just hate to make an exception. So I knew if I was going to read it, I was going to have to talk about it. And then, there's the obvious conflict of interest. I'm going to be hesitant to say anything critical because the guy's a friend. All that kind of stuff. So initially, when this was first published, I was still living in Vietnam. So it would have been very difficult to track it down anyways. Now I'm living in the US. I've been back in the US now for about a year and was still hesitant to track it down for the reasons I mentioned. But I was having coffee with another old college friend about a month ago. And she had a copy and she knew I'd be interested in it. So she just loaned me her copy, said, keep it as long as you want. And you can see here it's a rather slender volume. And the book that I'm currently trying to work my way through is Before the Muses here, which is this huge, thick volume. So when I needed a book to kind of kill time at the doctor's office, or when I was reading a book at lunch break at work, or when I take the kids to the park and I need a book to read while they're playing on the monkey bars or whatever, this book was much more appealing to take in the backpack than this book. And so because I already had it in hand and because I needed a slender volume to keep me occupied, well, this book sat mostly at home. Then I decided to just read it. Okay, so all of that is background into the review. So having followed Phil Christman on his various online platforms for years now, I am very familiar with both his writing style and his choice of subjects, the things he's interested in. And a lot of that is on full display here in this book. So when he talked about growing up in his hometown of Alma, Michigan, and some of the loneliness he felt there, I immediately recognized that. When he talked about one of his favorite authors, Marilyn Robinson, and her Gilead trilogy, I thought, okay, well, yeah, that's something he loves to talk about. When he fretted about the future of climate change, I recognized immediately, okay, that's definitely something that's on his mind and one of his big concerns. So yeah, it was a lot of familiar ground reading through this. And I like to think I'm somewhat familiar with his strengths and weaknesses as a writer. Of course, I say that like it's an objective truth. What I really should mean, of course, is how I perceive his strengths and weaknesses. So he has, ever since his college days, when he was writing for the college newspaper, been a talented writer, but the last 25 years of honing his craft has done him well, and he is much more of a talented writer now than in his college days, and he can really write elegant prose and turn a phrase. And again, I was familiar with this from following him online for several years, but I was even more impressed by reading this book. So, I guess I attribute that maybe to the difference between writing on a blog and then writing an essay that's published in a real publication, and then honing that essay into a book. And maybe refining the prose over and over again, or getting editorial feedback, or I don't know what went on behind the scenes. But this book, even as somebody who's been a fan of Phil for years, this book really surprised me by how well it was written. There are any number of paragraphs or sentences or pages in here that really pack a punch. Now, I'm not sure it's brilliantly written all the way through. So it's about 140 pages long. There are highs and lows over those 140 periods. But when he is on, he is really, really on. There are some brilliant passages in here. As I was reading the book, I would come across one of them and I'd say, oh boy, that is a really quotable paragraph. I should, type that out on my blog or something to save that. But then you'd go another couple pages and you'd come to another brilliant paragraph and you'd say, okay, well, that one's really good. I should, the whole thing is just full of these wonderful, wonderful little quotable bits. Sometimes a single sentence, sometimes whole paragraphs, sometimes even longer. So, yeah. And I know I'm biased because I'm a friend of the author, but this guy can really write well. It's when it's good, it's a very good piece of writing. I suppose I should come along to maybe some of my criticisms, maybe. So the premise of the book, Midwest Futures, about the Midwest. Now, to be fair, it sounds like what has happened here is that Phil had been talking about an idea that got commissioned by an editor into being an essay, and then later got commissioned by an editor into being a full book. So it's not like he just rolled out of bed and wrote this thing. He presumably had any number of things he could write about, and this is the one that the editor wanted him to write about. I almost wish that the editor would have commissioned a different piece out of Phil. Knowing Phil as I do, or at least knowing his body of work, I know that he has any number of other subjects he's interested in and can write eloquently on. Everything from the George Romero zombie movies to DC Comics Hawkman to Shakespeare or Samuel Johnson. So there are any number of subjects that he could have been written on, but the Midwest is it's an interesting subject. Now, I was looking at online reviews of this before I filmed this video, and especially on Goodreads, it looks like most people start off their review of this book by talking about how they're from the Midwest themselves and this book spoke to them, etc. And I suppose I might as well start the same way. I'm from the Midwest myself, and I have recently returned to the Midwest after living about 24 years abroad in various countries. And so I certainly do notice things about, I don't know about the Midwest, about America. Well, about the Midwest. That's where I am. After having been back, after having been away for so long. But the other thing is, I don't know how many times I've had to explain to people from other countries what Midwest means. And not even just people in Asian countries like Japan and Vietnam, but talking to other Westerners, talking to people from Europe or England or Australia. So they'll ask me where I'm from. I'll say, I'm from Michigan. They'll say, where's that? I'll say, oh, it's in the Midwest. They'll say, where's the Midwest? Or what's the Midwest? And then I usually have to explain to them that Michigan is actually in the Northeast. It's east of the Mississippi and up in the north. But we call it the Midwest. And then, of course, they say, well, why do you call it the Midwest if it's in the Northeast? And then I have to say, well, I guess because at one point in American history, you know, the western frontier just keeps on moving. And so at one point in American history, maybe that was the Midwest. So I've had this conversation about what is the Midwest any number of times where I've been abroad. So in that respect, somebody writing a whole book or a whole little book about what it means to be in the Midwest should theoretically be up my alley. And in fact, there are some interesting passages here where, at the beginning particularly, where Phil is exploring what exactly is the Midwest. Why does the Midwest contain the Northeast? And he mentions that little theory that I just mentioned earlier, that it's a historical relic from the time when the frontier was actually closer to the east now than it later became. Although I'd always just kind of accepted that as established fact. Curiously enough, Phil mentions that as kind of a prevailing urban legend about the term. Urban legend's not the correct term. Folk etymology about the term. And leaves open the possibility that it may be true, but it doesn't seem to... His tone is a little skeptical. His tone leads me to believe he thinks there's not a lot of evidence for that definition of the Midwest. So, yeah. The whole idea of what is the Midwest and why do we call things that are in the Northeast Midwest, all of that is, in theory, interesting to a degree. Perhaps not book length interesting. So, yeah, the problem is, as Phil explores in kind of his first chapter or two, Midwest is kind of a vague, undefined term, and there are lingering questions about what is or what is not included in the Northwest. You know, is Montana, in the Midwest? Questions about what is or not included in the Midwest. So, for example, is Montana in the Midwest, or is that just West? You know, are the Dakotas the Midwest, or are those plain states, etc.? And what is the Midwest character? So, you know, one of the things that's really struck me after coming back to Michigan, after having been away for so long, is how hilly the terrain is. You know, my wife, who's from Vietnam, is completely puzzled by this. Why you drive anywhere outside of the city and you're always going up and down and up and down and up and down. And I believe that's formed by the glaciers, the thousands of years ago. The glaciers advancing and retreating kind of created this very, what would you call it, up and down terrain. And there are parks around here where you can go and see some of the ravines that were created by the glaciers. And West Michigan especially is very woodsy. So there's lots of walking around and nature trails where you can explore. Sand dunes as you get near Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan itself is just amazing. So the topography of and you know, I've been away just long enough where I can really appreciate this coming back and saying, boy, you know, I always thought this was, growing up, I always thought Michigan was so boring, but really is a wonderful place with a lot of interesting places to explore. So the idea that it's just kind of a boring topography is not true at all, although that may be true of some of the plain states, Kansas or something like that. I don't know, people who live in Kansas, if you're watching this video, write in the comments and let me know why I'm wrong. But, you know, the Midwest as we traditionally view it as just kind of boring, flat farmland going on for forever has not struck my experience as somebody who's coming back here. Anyways, I'm getting off tangent. I tend to ramble when I do these unscripted videos. Point being, it's a little bit unclear what exactly is the Midwest, what are the boundaries of the Midwest, and what are the defining characteristics of the Midwest. So Phil explores that a little bit, and it's interesting to a degree, but having explored that a little bit, I wanted the book to just kind of move on to other topics. I didn't want it to keep circling roundabout on this question of the Midwest. So it arguably lacks a little bit of a forward momentum, perhaps constrained by the book's premise that it has to keep talking about the Midwest and kind of keep circling back to what is the Midwest. As well, I think any type of book where you... Sorry, let me back up a little bit. The whole question of trying to decipher what is the Midwest character is bound to be failure. Because really, when it comes down to it, there's no difference, or at least no important difference, between the Midwest and America. The Midwest character is the American character. I mean, you could argue that there are regional differences in the cultures between the Midwest and California, and I'm sure there are, maybe. But they're not the differences that matter. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, none of us are really defined by these differences anyways. People are ultimately people. More similar than we are different, and more diverse among ourselves than any attempt to define groups would allow. And you would run into this problem with any kind of sociological writing or any kind of travel type writing. And, I used to read a fair amount of these books when I first moved abroad. So when I was first in Japan, I read any number of books about what are Japanese people like. And of course, you're reading those books and you're like, okay, Japanese people are like this. But then you're going out and you're encountering all the people you're meeting on the street, and you're like, okay, well, he doesn't fit the stereotype, and he doesn't fit the stereotype. Ultimately, any attempt to kind of define or describe a group of people is bound to end up in failure. All that is a long way of saying there are parts of this book where I wanted him to leave the Midwest behind and move on to other topics, and for periods he does, but then we just keep coming back to the Midwest. And what I think is an ultimately uninteresting exercise in trying to nail down the character of the Midwest. Now, I've read some other reviews of this book on Amazon and Goodreads where other people do not feel like this is a problem at all. They find it a delightfully charming deep dive into the Midwest character. To each his own. I could have done with a book on another topic, maybe. That being said, though, there is a lot of interesting details Phil gives about the history and the future of the Midwest, and you can see that in the title here, Midwest Futures. A lot of interesting details I didn't know about, and Phil approaches this from a political standpoint very close to mine, or an ideological standpoint very close to mine, which is anti-capitalist, and looking at the way that the Midwest has been shaped as a lot of possibilities, but those possibilities were ultimately upended by powerful people doing things in their own self-interest, which shaped the eventual history of the Midwest. Well, one of the running themes throughout his book is that none of this was inevitable. But this is the way things chose to play out, is powerful people making decisions that created a lot of the conditions and problems, such as gentrification and pollution we have in the Midwest now. When the initial founders of the Midwest, there were a lot of utopians among them. A lot of people envisioned it as kind of these utopian communities or Thomas Jefferson, Phil points out in his opening chapter, envisioned it as a land of agrarian farmers who would contribute to a yeoman farmers' democracy, I believe was the phrase. So that history is all very interesting. Again, it's not always in a linear form. It kind of circles back on the question of Midwesternness. But at its best, I think this book reads like a people's history of the Midwest. Like Howard Zinn famously wrote A People's History of the United States, which I believe inspired a whole bunch of books in a people's history of genre. This could almost be a people's history of the Midwest. And I am not expert enough to critique his historical interpretation in terms of accuracy, although, as I already mentioned, ideologically, I'm quite sympathetic to it. And there are, it's a very powerful, I guess, critique of the way the history has gone, in ways that it didn't have to do, and ways that were not beneficial to everyone, in ways that benefited the powerful instead of the normal people. And so those sections of the book are quite good, and I'm not sure what proportion of the book they make up. Maybe about 50% of the book, maybe a bit more, and I think that is enough to solidly recommend this book as something which is good reading to anybody who's curious. Now, I suppose it probably goes without saying that people who are ideologically opposed to this book are going to be resistant to that. And again, if you look at Amazon or Goodreads, some of the negative reviews of this book come from people who have different ideological viewpoints. It's an interesting question about how well this book functions as something to convert people who start into it from other ideological standpoints. I've got a feeling that Phil would argue that it's not meant to convert anyone. So maybe we don't even need to ask that question. I'm not sure how well it would work to. I'm not sure how well it would work to convert someone if we were to ask that question. But yeah, let me know what you think. If you've read this book and if you're from a different ideological viewpoint, how well you thought it might work for you. Phil is, again, this is something I've noticed from reading his various blogs over the years, very earnest. Very earnest about his beliefs and earnest about his own thought processes or his how well he himself is living up to his beliefs in a way that is refreshing to read something so earnest and honest on the paper or on the screen as he's written for several years on his blog. It can also at times almost border on a little bit too much when he gets a little bit too much into talking about his own self-doubts or his own worries about how well he's living up to his own ideals. So I guess that's the kind of thing where you either love it or you hate it. The climate change is a good example. He's well aware of the tension between what the seriousness of the problem and perhaps he's not doing enough to resolve it. Or since this book was published in 2020, the kind of rise of political authoritarianism on the right, aka Trump and his mega base. And again, that's another thing which he explores and also explores whether he's doing enough about it. And so that kind of earnest self-reflection on the page is, well, it cuts both ways, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I am running out of time. The video camera I'm using cuts out after 30 minutes. There are other things I perhaps could say about this book if I allowed myself to talk longer, but why embarrass myself by doing that, huh? I think I've embarrassed myself enough. I will finish things out here. I would recommend this book, but then don't take my word for it because I'm biased.